Hello again. One of the things people never seem to remember is that although Britain certainly played an important part in the transatlantic slave trade, we then spent a century or so making amends for it. Our navy was used to do all that was humanly possible to suppress the slave trade in and from Africa. In this endeavour, Britain stood alone against the world. In Europe, America, Brazil, and the Arab world, to say nothing of Africa itself, there were many people who were keen to see slavery continue and wished to take slaves from Africa and transport them to other parts of the world. Britain did its best to prevent this from happening. Brazil and the United States were both desperately trying to acquire slaves in Africa and take them across the Atlantic during the mid-19th century, but the Royal Navy frustrated their efforts. In Zanzibar and East Africa, Britain disrupted and finally brought an end to the Arab slave trade in that area. At the same time, they fought the practice in Africa itself. This part of British history is swept under the carpet, of course, today, because it would harm the movement to claim reparations for slavery, which is likely to be very profitable for people living in the Caribbean and the United States. Instead, British actions are deliberately distorted and made to appear shabby. I dare say that many viewers have heard of the restoration of the so-called Benin bronzes, which are being sent to Nigeria, which now occupies the area where Benin City once stood. You can see one of the Benin bronzes in the thumbnail to this video. This was, of course, the heart of the West African slave trade, and it was a trade operated by the Africans themselves. Even when the market dried up for exporting slaves to the Americas and the Caribbean, Benin and Dahomey kept using and trading in slaves for their own purposes, a custom in that part of Africa with very ancient roots. The Kingdom of Benin was in the south of what is now Nigeria, and it was one of the places where European traders went when they wanted to buy slaves. Benin itself, though, which included the Kingdom of Dahomey, was already very familiar with slavery centuries before the first Europeans anchored off the coast. The trade in and exploitation of slaves had flourished in Benin long before the coming of white people to West Africa. Archaeological excavations have revealed, for instance, a sacrifice of slaves which was customary throughout most of the ancient world on the death of a king. We see this in so many cultures that it can hardly be expected that Africa would prove an exception. Archaeologist Graham Connor unearthed a total of 41 female skeletons, all buried in one pit. These dated from the 13th century and are assumed to be victims of human sacrifice, most likely slaves. By the end of the 19th century, Benin was still full of slaves, and these were used as victims in ritual sacrifices and various other awful things. It was chiefly to put an end to slavery that the British landed troops there in 1897 and occupied the city of Benin. Some bronzes were brought back to this country from Benin, and it is these which are being returned to Nigeria. In the United States, though, there is opposition to sending the Benin bronzes to Nigeria among some African Americans. This is because they are the descendants of slaves which the traders of Benin and Dahomey sold to American slave traders. These people feel that it's wrong to reward the descendants of the slave traders who sold them to America, and they say that the bronzes should stay in museums in Britain where they can be seen by everybody. This is a small illustration of how complex the past is, especially relating to matters like slavery, and how even today it is difficult to disentangle who owes what and to whom. This kind of controversy, though, is something we never hear about in the British news, because a simple narrative is preferred of white British people being villains and black Africans always innocent victims. This is appealingly straightforward and easy to understand, although also, of course, completely wrong and thoroughly misleading.